Welcome back to the second episode of Musical Soundbites, where I'll introduce two pieces by local composers, Professor Ho Chee Kong and Joonatan Shin. The composer of the first work featured in this episode is Prof. Ho Chee Kong. Apart from being an associate professor at the Yong Siew Toh Conservatory of Music at the National University of Singapore, Prof. Ho's works for both Western and Chinese ensembles have been performed at festivals and concerts around the world. The Last Dragonfly Dance was written for flautist Roberto Alvarez and harpist Katrina Tan. The work was dedicated to Mr. Leong Yun Pin, one of Singapore's pioneering local composers, who passed away shortly before the premiere of the work in 2010. On the score, there are no articulation or dynamic markings. Prof. Ho's intention was to allow for the performers to decide how they wish for the performance to be. When composers were the ones performing their work, the music score may be missing some performance information, as the composers themselves would express the music accordingly during the performance. However, composers begin to write in more information into the score when others perform the work instead, to a point where composers would often dictate in detail how the work should be performed. The Last Dragonfly Dance is about finding that balance between what he had in mind about the piece and how the performers choose to interpret it, drawing from their own musicality, experiences, and emotions. The imagery for this piece is inspired by the Chinese idiom 蜻蜓点水, which literally translates to a dragonfly skimming the surface of the water. It gives form to the interaction between the flute and the harp for the piece and provides both figurative and literal imageries for the performers. Unlike traditional duets where one instrument leads the other, as with a sonata or a concerto, The Last Dragonfly Dance is a work that requires two independent instrumentalists to interact with each other. The intervals between the flute and the harp vary throughout the piece, close to each other but not always together, and there are moments when the instrument lines touch each other lightly, like a dance. While both the flute or saxophone and the harp share similar scalic and melodic materials, they each have different independent lines. Just as the dragonfly and the water ripples on the reservoir surface have their own movements. The artistry that eventually crystallizes will not only be a bridge between the performers and the composer, but it is also very much a communication and negotiation between the two performers. He was curious to see how the work would sound like with a saxophone and harp, so I enlisted the help of my harpist friend, Maaria, to perform this work with me. Let's have a listen. I asked Prof. Ho what he thinks makes Singaporean music unique, and he replied that we do not need to rush to create a unique music identity, as most music, including European and Chinese music, had developed over an extensive period of time. In a country like Singapore, it takes time to integrate multicultural elements into a single identity. Therefore, we really cannot take shortcuts to find our identity. One day, we may have our own music identity, or we may not. If other cultural or societal influences outpace the development of our musical identity, we may share a collective music identity with the world. I have with me right now the brilliant pianist and composer Joonatan Shin, who is currently completing his doctoral studies at the Peabody Conservatory. So John, can you walk me through the conception of this work, Lunarabesque?
So I wrote lunarabesque in March 2020, actually. And this was actually part of my course in Peabody. I was going to write for this amazing oboist.
Catherine Needleman.
Yes, Catherine Needleman, that's right. Thank you very much. So I had her sound in mind when I was writing it. But more importantly, I was really trying to explore, because I've been a pianist almost my entire life. And so the connection between sort of pianist and instrumentalist, I love accompanying chamber-wise, having that sort of interaction. I wanted to explore a piece where there's a lot of unspoken sort of connection and electricity between the pianist and whoever I'm working with. So I'm sure you're fine, maybe you can disagree, but in this piece, there's a lot of places where you have to sort of breathe together and sort of, dance. And I wrote, of course, in the program notes that this piece is about dancing, specifically under the moon on a beach, like on a beautiful ocean, but without touching. And I think hopefully that music, gets that feeling. Yeah.
I really like the jazz harmonies and jazz chords. Was it something that you had in mind?
So jazz was a huge part of my life, coming from, I'd say, 2011. I had my first jazz CD, which was Oscar Peterson's Night Train, which I think is the seminal piano trio album. And then from then on, it was this, I see it as a sort of a different country. For me, I have the classical music passport, and I've yet to, gain entry, sort of, because it's a different feel. Like, the third movement, it's just the feel, it's not so much a metronome mark, right? Like, oh, what's the BPM? No, it's more of like, how are you sitting and how are you like sort of jive, sort of going with each other. And I think, I'm glad that came across because for me, it was crucial to just have a lot of fun. Yeah.
What I really liked about the work was because it's such a really well-written jazz work, where everything is annotated. Did you have to, what was the process behind writing the work? Was there a lot of improvising involved?
Really good question. I like that question. So I don't see this so much as a jazz work, but as I really don't. I feel like it's still in the classical, but like me trying to find my own true language, because I feel I'm rather adept at writing pastiche or like kitsch music, music that's already been written for, and I do it my own way, cheeky styles, But for this music, I really felt like it was me, and I could do whatever I want.
Can you walk me through a little bit of the process which you compose pieces?
So I've been very fortunate these days, getting commissions. And for me, sometimes these commissions come in and they want a certain element in that piece of music. And so I'm thinking, how do I put those elements in? How do I, tick those boxes? But at the same time, how can I have fun writing it, and how can my eventual performers, have fun writing it? So that's one thing. When I'm writing music that I personally am interested, and it's always for specific people in mind. For example, a certain cadenza that I wrote for you, I had your movement in mind. A certain cellist, I would have his movement in mind, the way he bows one note, or a violinist and a pianist. And so I'm writing for specifically person A and person B, the way they experience the music. So that's very important for me. And then the next part, I walk a lot. Well, at least in the US, I walked a lot. And, I would walk outside Harvard. There was a huge park over there. And that's how I'll bring my sketchbook along. And then that's where I'll write my music. In fact, off screen, my notebook is over there, And I find I write most of my best music on the train. I use pencil and paper. I always start with pencil and paper. And then a few bars in, maybe like 50, 60 bars in, that's when I'll start putting it on...
notation software.
Yeah, exactly. Computer. And so then there's that sort of transfer. If it's an orchestral work, I always start with the piano transcription, usually 4 hands. And then after I'll start orchestrating them. And that's two different processes for me. Composition is a good few weeks, and then orchestration is a good few months. That's how I think about it. Yeah.
Do you think the saxophone managed to, express what you wanted to do, considering that this is ultimately a transcription of a work that was originally written for oboe?
Well, I'll have to say this was entirely a surprise, because I never thought a saxophonist would pick up the piece. And in my experience so far, it's working very well for the saxophone. And I've worked with many, transcriptions myself. For example, I've played Don't Ask Me Why, but I've played Mendelssohn piano trio. I feel like this is sacrilegious. I've played Mendelssohn piano trio with, instead of violin and cello, I played it with flute and cello and piano, of course. So, sometimes it works and sometimes, but for this particular thing, I think it absolutely, you absolutely hit the spot, with the way you were so assiduous in your preparation. You were constantly checking in. It's just brilliant. You checked in. I was like, please stop calling me. It's 3 a.m. I just need to concentrate on my own life, but you always ask, like, how should I play this? And so it's been my honor and pleasure, really, having you play this and then taking this to Finland, premiering it there, and getting like your colleagues to play it as well. So I'm really thankful. Yeah.
So in this journey of yours as a musician, what do you think are some of the important lessons you've picked up?
There's a lot, actually. There's stuff I pick up from classical and stuff I pick up from jazz. And I think some will disagree. Some of my friends will say, no, it's universal. Sure. Always be listening. Yeah, always be listening is huge. And that applies whether you're in whether it doesn't matter if it's classical or jazz. It's universal, And for me, personally, I take a lot of pleasure in slowing down and sort of like really getting absorbed in nature. So that's just personally for me. Yeah, I'd say listening is a good place to start from. And I don't mean just like listen. I mean like really deep, thoughtful listening where you are like thinking about what you've just heard. And it's really hard to sort of enunciate the entire process like here. But I would say that's one of my biggest lessons. I feel like I'm going to suffer from a case of the staircase. Like when I get out of here, I'm going to be like, shucks, I should have said something else. But that's the only one that's coming to my mind right now. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Now let's hear an excerpt from Lunarabesque. Thank you very much for joining us on this episode of Musical Soundbites. We hope you've learned something new about the works and inspirations of Prof. Ho and Joonatan. See you next time, where we'll speak to two other composers. Take care.
Bye-bye.